top-secret war footage shows a UFO over the battlefield. And then everyone disappeared. Declassified footage, missing soldiers, and a cover-up no one wants to talk about. The sky was a dull gray, the kind of overcast that makes even the bravest soldier pause and check the horizon. Somewhere out there, beyond the barbed wire and trenches, the battlefield stretched endlessly, as far as the eye could see. But on that particular day, the dullness wasn't just a reflection of the sky. It was the feeling in the air. Something was off. No one knew it yet, but what they were about to witness would forever alter the course of history. It would be something that no one could explain. Not even the most hardened soldiers, who had seen their share of horror, could make sense of what happened. It all started with a flash. Just a quick, bright streak across the sky. But it wasn't lightning. It didn't follow the natural rules of storms. It was something else, something otherworldly. And then, as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. The men stood frozen for a moment, unsure whether they had just witnessed an illusion brought on by exhaustion, or if they had truly seen something they were never meant to see. But then it happened again. A slow-moving light, a faint glow at the edge of the forest, hanging there like a strange star. Only this time, it didn't vanish. It lingered. The soldiers exchanged nervous glances, trying to brush it off as a trick of the light or an unusual weather phenomenon. But deep down, they knew. They knew that something was wrong. And they couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a sign of nature at work. It was a sign of something more. Something unnatural. A voice cracked over the radio, a familiar face from the command post, asking the soldiers for a status update. But the usual chatter about enemy positions and supply drops was absent. For a moment, there was silence on the line. Then one of the men, his voice shaky but determined, spoke into the radio. "We're seeing something. We don't know what it is, sir, but we need backup." That was the moment everything changed. You might be wondering why this wasn't reported earlier. Why didn't anyone speak up about what they saw? The truth is, the military knew the risks of exposing too much. This wasn't just any war. This was something darker, something bigger than anyone realized. And the footage that was later discovered would remain locked away for decades. But why? What did they see? What happened to those soldiers? Why did no one talk about it? Why did they vanish? This story is more than just a strange encounter. It's a mystery that has haunted generations. And it all begins with a question that nobody ever truly answered. What was that light in the sky? What would you do if you were there? If you were one of the soldiers standing on that battlefield, staring at something that no one could explain? Would you trust your eyes? Or would you dismiss it as some kind of trick? The soldiers didn't have that luxury. They had to face it. And when they did, everything changed. The next morning, the air felt thicker. It wasn't just the fog that had rolled in from the woods. It was something else. Something intangible, yet undeniable. The soldiers were already on high alert, their nerves still rattled by the night's strange light. Yet, none of them spoke of it. It wasn't that they were too afraid to mention it. No, it was something worse. They didn't want to acknowledge what they had seen. But deep down, they knew they couldn't ignore it. Something had changed. Corporal Mitchell stood at the edge of the forest, scanning the dense trees with binoculars. His eyes darted nervously from shadow to shadow, searching for something, anything, that would explain what had happened. He couldn't shake the image of the light from his mind. It wasn't just an anomaly. It was alive. It didn't flicker like a lamp, or fade like the stars. It moved. And it hadn't been the kind of light you'd expect from a weather phenomenon or aircraft. This was different. Suddenly, A distant shout broke his concentration. A soldier, Private Keller, ran toward him, his face pale and wide-eyed. "You won't believe this," Keller gasped, breathless. "We found something, in the woods." Mitchell didn't hesitate. He grabbed his rifle and followed Keller, his boots crunching over the forest floor as they pushed deeper into the trees. The eerie silence of the woods surrounded them. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the whisper of the wind. As they moved forward, Keller spoke again, his voice unsteady. It's a piece of metal. I don't know what it is, but it looks like it's from another world." Mitchell's heart rate spiked. Another piece of the puzzle. But he couldn't understand why they were finding this now. Was it related to the light? Or was it something else entirely? As they reached the clearing where Keller had seen the object, Mitchell froze. There, lying in the middle of the clearing, was a strange fragment of metallic debris. It was unlike anything Mitchell had ever seen. The surface was smooth, almost too smooth, and reflected the sunlight in a way that didn't seem natural. It shimmered with an iridescent glow, as if it was alive, changing with every angle. There were no markings, no insignia, nothing that could indicate what it was or where it had come from. A chilling thought crept into Mitchell's mind. Was this what they were seeing in the sky? The same smooth, glowing surface, the same unnatural light. He knelt down, inspecting it carefully. There was a faint humming noise coming from the metal, like an energy that pulsed beneath the surface. His fingers brushed against it, and the moment he made contact, something happened. The air around them seemed to thicken, as though a storm was suddenly rising. Mitchell jerked his hand back, feeling the sharp, electric buzz that lingered in the air. Keller took a step back, his face a mixture of fear and disbelief. "What the hell is that thing?" he whispered. Mitchell didn't have an answer. They were about to turn back when something else caught Mitchell's attention. Something far worse, a shadow. At the edge of the clearing, just beyond the tree line, he saw it. A figure. It was barely visible, almost as though it was blending into the forest itself. But it was there, and it was watching them. Mitchell's breath hitched in his throat. He raised his rifle slowly, his instincts screaming at him to take action. But the figure didn't move. It stood there, still and silent, like it had been there for ages, just waiting. "Did you see that?" Keller asked, his voice shaking. Mitchell nodded, his hand tight around his weapon. He was about to call out when the figure, if it even was a figure, vanished. Disappeared into the woods like a wisp of smoke. No sound, no movement, just gone. His heart raced. They had all seen it. "Get back to camp," Mitchell ordered. But the words didn't feel like enough. They were already too deep in something they couldn't explain, something they didn't understand. As they made their way back, the soldiers began talking about it. First, it was just whispers. Was it some kind of mirage? Some trick of the light? But then, more soldiers started speaking up. They had seen things too. Lights, shadows, strange objects, things that couldn't be explained by ordinary means. The reports flooded in, each one more bizarre than the last. One soldier swore he saw an entire section of the sky ripple, like water disturbed by an unseen force. Another talked about hearing voices on the wind, voices that weren't from their camp. No one could explain what was happening, and the silence that followed each report was deafening. Mitchell stood in the command tent, the weight of everything pressing down on him. The reports were coming in from all over, but the higher-ups, they didn't seem concerned. "Keep your head down. Focus on the enemy," their commanding officer had said, dismissing them as if the unexplained events were nothing more than distractions. But Mitchell knew better. He could feel it in his bones. This wasn't just some odd occurrence. Something larger, something more sinister, was unfolding right in front of them. The next day, the strange occurrences grew stronger. The lights in the sky returned, more intense this time. And when they looked to the ground, something was different. The forest seemed to have changed. Trees that had been there the day before were gone. And in their place, strange markings, symbols, etched deep into the bark. No one knew what they meant. But it was clear. Whatever was happening, it wasn't just some random anomaly. It was the beginning of something far worse. And they were caught right in the middle of it. The footage is grainy, flickering like a candle in the wind. But it's clear enough to see the terror in the eyes of the soldiers. Among them, there's one face that stands out, a man who survived. His name is Sergeant David Moore, and he's the one who would later be called to testify about what happened that day. But even after all these years, his voice trembles when he recounts the events. It all happened so fast, Moore says, sitting across from the interviewer, his weathered face betraying the weight of what he's lived through. We thought we were prepared for anything. You get used to the sounds of war, the explosions, the gunfire, but nothing prepares you for that. He pauses, staring into the distance, lost in thought for a moment before continuing. It was like something shifted, a pressure in the air. You know how it feels right before a storm? But this wasn't a storm. It felt unnatural, like the world itself was holding its breath. Flashbacks from that day begin to replay in his mind. Scenes that are still as vivid as the moment they first happened. The strange lights in the sky, the glowing fragments of metal, and the feeling of being watched, even when no one was around. He was one of the first to approach the area where the metal object had been found, back when they thought it was just a freak occurrence. But as the days passed, that initial sense of curiosity began to shift into something else. Something darker. The strange figure he saw in the forest, just beyond the clearing, was burned into his memory. I remember thinking it was one of the enemy, trying to stay hidden, maybe doing the same thing we were, scouting. But then, it was like it wasn't human. The shape, the way it moved, it didn't make sense. Moore's voice quivers as he recalls the moment. It didn't even have a face. Not like we would recognize one. Just a shadow, a shape that didn't belong. There's a long silence as Moore looks down at his hands, the image of the figure still too fresh in his mind to shake. The interviewer leans in, sensing the weight of the moment. What happened next? Moore sighs deeply, the sound of his breath heavy with the burden of what he's about to relive. We kept moving forward, but we were all on edge by then. We couldn't ignore what we'd seen. We should have turned back. We didn't, and that's the mistake we made. The footage flickers again, and then it cuts to another scene. A radio transmission. In it, Moore's voice is heard, crackling with static. "Command, we've found something. I don't know what it is, but it's not like anything we've seen before." The words hang in the air, a haunting reminder of how things began to spiral out of control. At first, they thought the glowing debris in the woods was some sort of weapon, maybe something left behind from a previous battle or even an experimental device. They were wrong. In the days that followed, more and more strange occurrences began to happen, almost as if the world itself was rejecting them. The soldiers began hearing strange noises at night, whispers that sounded too close, like someone was standing just behind them, breathing down their necks. Some of the men thought it was just paranoia, brought on by fatigue, but others started to believe there was something more to it. "Things weren't right," Moore continues, his voice distant now. "I was in the camp when it happened. I remember the air getting so still, no wind, no sound, and then, out of nowhere, there was this hum. It started faint but grew louder until it felt like the earth was vibrating beneath us. It was unnerving. It didn't feel like a storm or an explosion. It felt like the world itself was being torn apart. Moore rubs his forehead, trying to push back the memories, but they're always there, just beneath the surface. I've seen a lot of things in my time. War does that to you. It makes you numb to the chaos, but this wasn't like anything else. It was wrong. The camera switches to a clip taken from another soldier's helmet cam, showing the vast, empty battlefield with nothing in sight but the misty fog creeping in. Suddenly, the ground starts to tremble. The soldiers stop dead in their tracks, eyes wide in shock. Above them, a dark shape slowly emerges, casting an unnatural shadow across the field. It's massive, hovering with an eerie, silent grace, and for a moment, everyone forgets to breathe. That's when the chaos began. The object, whatever it was, moved with unnatural speed, darting across the sky in a zigzag pattern, faster than any aircraft they had ever seen. Then, just as quickly, it disappeared, leaving behind a stunned silence. But the silence didn't last. The hum returned, growing more intense, louder, vibrating through their chests, making their teeth rattle. And as it reached its peak, a single flash of light pierced the sky. Some soldiers dropped to the ground, covering their ears. Others looked to the sky in confusion. But Moore, who had been standing closest to the epicenter of the flash, fell to his knees, hands gripping his head in pain. "I thought I was going to die," he recalls, his voice barely above a whisper. It felt like the whole world was being erased, like we didn't belong there anymore. When he opened his eyes again, everything had changed. The men around him were confused, disoriented. Some looked like they had aged years in a matter of seconds. But it wasn't just their appearances that had shifted. It was something else, something darker. The soldiers began to turn on each other. Some, like Moore, had no memory of what happened during the flash. Others claimed to have seen things, strange images, figures, fleeting moments of terror that were impossible to explain. The stories didn't match. They couldn't. They didn't know what had happened. They didn't know why it had happened. Moore, however, would carry something else with him. A deeper understanding that would come much later, after everything had already spiraled out of control. But what he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that their lives were about to change in a way they couldn't even begin to imagine. And as the days went by, something even more terrifying began to unfold. People started disappearing, vanishing without a trace. No struggle, no sign of violence. They were simply gone. The soldiers, one by one, were picked off until only a handful remained. Those who did manage to survive would be haunted by what they had seen, forever marked by the experience. David Moore survived. He lived to tell the tale. But there were others, too. Others who had vanished that day, their fates sealed by a force that none of them could hope to understand. The days blurred together after the first disappearance. It was as if time itself had warped in the wake of the event, and the soldiers were caught in the middle of something far beyond their comprehension. The remaining men, the survivors of that chaotic moment, huddled together like nervous animals, their eyes darting to the horizon, expecting something, anything, to come out of the mist. But nothing did. At first, the atmosphere was one of disbelief. They were trained to fight, to defend, to follow orders. But how could they respond to something that defied every rule they knew? How could they fight something they couldn't even see? The first sign that things were getting worse came in the form of strange sounds, low, rhythmic noises that seemed to come from the earth itself. The sound wasn't mechanical, like an engine or a machine. It was like the hum of an electrical current, distant, pulsing in the background, vibrating the air with a sense of foreboding. Some men thought it was their minds playing tricks on them, stress, exhaustion, fear, but it persisted. A constant, gnawing hum that dug into their minds. Lieutenant Richards, a man who had been hardened by years of service, was one of the first to speak out loud about it. "We're not alone," he said, his voice low, as if he were afraid of saying it too loudly. "This thing is hunting us." The words hung in the air like a curse. Richards wasn't one to give in to fear easily, but what he had seen, what they had all seen, had begun to break his mind. The shadows they had noticed on the edge of the clearing weren't just hallucinations. There was something watching them, something waiting. The survivors began to feel the weight of that presence. It wasn't just the missing men. It was the constant pressure, the quiet, suffocating sensation that something else was lurking just out of sight, watching, observing. But as they would soon learn, it wasn't just the environment that was shifting. It was them, too. One evening, as they gathered around a campfire, trying to regain some sense of normalcy, something strange happened. Private Harris, who had been silent for hours, suddenly stood up. His movements were stiff, mechanical, as if something had taken over him. His eyes were wide, unblinking, staring into the flames, but they weren't his eyes anymore. They were empty, cold. The men watched in horror as Harris turned slowly, his body jerking unnaturally, and walked toward the edge of the camp. "Harris!" Sergeant Moore shouted, rising from his seat. But Harris didn't respond. He didn't even seem to hear him. As Harris reached the edge of the camp, he stopped. His body tensed, and then, with a sudden, almost robotic motion, he collapsed to the ground. The other soldiers rushed to his side, but by the time they reached him, Harris had already vanished. His body was cold to the touch, his face pale as if he had been dead for hours. "We need to get out of here," Moore said, his voice shaky with fear. The others nodded in silent agreement. But the strange occurrences didn't stop there. In the days that followed, it became apparent that the forest itself was changing. Trees that had been standing for decades seemed to wither overnight, their bark peeling away as though burned by an unseen fire. And in their place, more of those strange markings, etched deep into the wood. No one knew what they meant, but they were everywhere. Private Keller, who had been one of the first to encounter the glowing metal, was the next to experience something truly bizarre. He had been walking alone, trying to clear his mind after the unsettling events of the past few days, when he stumbled across an object, something small, half buried in the dirt. At first he thought it was just another piece of debris, but as he bent down to inspect it, he realized that it was far more than that. The object was made of the same iridescent metal as the fragments they had discovered earlier, but this piece was different. It was a small sphere, roughly the size of a baseball, and it hummed, just like the strange vibrations they had felt before. Keller picked it up, holding it carefully in his hands, and immediately felt a sharp pain in his head. It was as though his mind was being pulled toward the object, drawn into it by some unseen force. For a split second, he thought he saw something, someone, standing in front of him, but when he blinked, they were gone. That's when the vision started. It wasn't a hallucination. He was certain of that. It was real. In the span of just a few moments, Keller saw images, flashes of a battle long past. The soldiers in his vision were dressed in old military garb, their faces grim, their eyes filled with fear. He saw them standing on the same battlefield he was now, looking up at the same sky. But there was something else there, something that shouldn't have been. A ship, enormous, its sleek black surface reflecting the fiery red glow of the horizon. The ship hovered above the battlefield, casting a massive shadow over the soldiers below. It was silent. But Keller could hear the screams, their screams, as they looked up at the sky, their faces twisted in terror. He could hear the wind howling, feel the tension in the air. And then everything went black. He snapped back to reality, gasping for air. His heart pounded in his chest, and for a moment he could still feel the presence of that ship, looming over him like a predator waiting to strike. He dropped the sphere and ran back to camp, his mind racing with questions. What had he seen? Was it a vision? A memory? And more importantly, what did it mean? When he arrived back at the camp, the others were already talking in hushed voices, sharing their own experiences, their own brushes with the unexplainable. It was clear now that they were all having similar visions, flashes of the past and future, things that shouldn't have been possible. The survivors were unraveling. And with each passing hour, the strange hum grew louder, more insistent. They could feel it vibrating in their bones, digging under their skin. And they knew that whatever was happening, it wasn't just the forest or the sky that was changing. It was them. They were being drawn into something that they didn't understand, something ancient. And as the events escalated, as their grip on reality began to slip, they realized one horrifying truth. Whatever it wasn't done with them yet. The survivors had grown used to the strange events now, though they still couldn't make sense of any of it. They had become almost desensitized to the eerie hum that seemed to follow them wherever they went, the strange disappearances, and the unsettling visions. But there was something deeper at play here, something that connected their current experience with a past long buried in history. The men began to realize that the strange occurrences were not entirely random. They weren't just fighting a battle. They were part of something much larger, something that had been set in motion long before they arrived on that cursed battlefield. It was Sergeant Moore who first made the connection, a fleeting thought that began to take root when he found an old, tattered map in one of the abandoned military outposts. It wasn't just any map. It was a military map, from a time before the current conflict, one marked with strange symbols and routes that didn't make sense. The markings on the map weren't anything like the standard military symbols they were used to. There were spirals, intricate designs that resembled ancient runes, and dots that seemed to represent specific locations on the battlefield. Moore's fingers traced them, the cold metal of his glove skimming over the faded paper. He felt a chill run down his spine as the pieces began to fit together. It was almost as though someone had anticipated this, whatever this was, and had left clues behind. His mind raced. The map had been buried beneath piles of debris, tucked inside a rusted chest, forgotten by time. How had it ended up here? And why had no one thought to investigate it earlier? Moore spread the map out on the dirt floor of their temporary shelter, his voice a low murmur. This doesn't belong here. It's older than anything we've got." Keller and Richards crowded around him, peering down at the symbols. "Where did you find this?" Richards asked, his voice filled with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. "In the old command post," Moore replied, still feeling the weight of the discovery. "But these markings, they're not just military, they're ancient. I've seen something like this before." The others stared at him, confused. Moore wasn't sure how to explain it. It had been years ago, a fleeting memory from a university lecture he'd attended, a seminar on the unexplained phenomena during past wars. But what really stood out were the images of strange occurrences, lights in the sky, disappearances, and soldiers who returned from battle with odd, unexplainable injuries. They all had one thing in common: the same symbols. They were part of an ancient conspiracy, a kind of occult belief, Moore muttered under his breath. There's a connection to ancient civilizations, the ones who believed in celestial beings visiting the Earth. His words hit the others like a slap. You're saying this is something that's been happening for centuries? Keller asked. Moore nodded grimly. It's not just us. This place, this battlefield, it's been the site of something much bigger than a military conflict. What if these disappearances, the strange lights, the hums we're hearing, what if it's all connected to this site's history? What if it's been happening for decades? The other men exchanged uneasy glances. They had never considered that the events happening now were tied to something far more ancient. Could the lights in the sky, the disappearance of their comrades, the unnatural coldness of the air, be related to a much older history? Wait a second, Keller said, his mind racing. You're saying this was planned? That we walked into something set up before we even arrived? Moore didn't respond immediately. Instead, his eyes fixed on the map again, tracing the symbols with his finger. Then, as if struck by lightning, he pulled back a loose piece of paper that had been folded inside the map. Underneath, there was a faded photograph. It was a black and white image, taken from a different time, a different era. But the location was unmistakable. The very place they had been fighting. In the photo, a group of soldiers stood in front of a large, dark ship, its sleek shape unlike any aircraft they had ever seen. The ship was enormous, towering above the men, casting a long shadow over the barren ground. The men in the photo were dressed in old military uniforms, but there was something off about their expressions. Their faces were eerily calm, almost too calm for the circumstances, as if they had expected something to happen, as if they were waiting for it. What the hell? Richards muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. That ship, it's the same one from the vision I had, the one Keller saw too. It's not a coincidence, is it? Moore nodded slowly, his stomach sinking. Number, it's not. This photo is from a different war, decades ago. But I think it's the same thing. That ship, that force, whatever it is, it's been here before. It's always been here. The idea of repeating history, of walking into a situation that had played out before, sent chills down their spines. How could this have gone unnoticed for so long? How could it be that something so huge, something so unnatural, had been allowed to persist through time, hidden from the world? Moore's thoughts drifted back to the map. Something about the coordinates on it kept nagging at him, the patterns, the symbols. It was almost as if it was marking specific locations on the battlefield. But why? Why had these places been marked? What significance did they hold? He looked at Richards and Keller. We need to go back to those locations. We need to see what's there. If this map is right, these places, they might hold the key to understanding everything. Everything that's been happening. They agreed, though no one felt confident. They had all seen the horrors this battlefield had to offer, and the idea of uncovering even more terrifying truths seemed almost too much to bear. But Moore was right. They had no choice. They had to understand what was happening, even if it meant uncovering things that they weren't prepared to face. The air was thick with tension as the soldiers gathered their equipment and prepared to leave the camp behind. The eerie hum that had been gnawing at their nerves for days seemed to echo louder now, as if the forest itself was alive, watching them. They had no choice but to move forward. The clues were inescapable. The map, the markings, the photograph, everything was pointing them toward something darker, something that had been hiding in plain sight for far too long. As Moore, Richards, and Keller trekked into the woods, the atmosphere grew colder. The mist, which had once seemed like a natural occurrence, now felt oppressive, as if it were closing in around them, obscuring their path and clouding their minds. The trees groaned with every gust of wind, their branches creaking like old bones. It wasn't just the usual unsettling sounds of the forest. It was something else, something unnatural, twisting the familiar into something monstrous. Every step they took seemed to echo in the stillness, the crunch of their boots in the underbrush louder than it should have been. It felt as if the forest was swallowing them whole, and with each passing moment, the sense of being watched intensified. It wasn't just the feeling of being observed from the shadows anymore. No, it was something much more visceral, a sensation that crawled under their skin, pricking every nerve. Keller shivered, pulling his jacket tighter around himself. "You feel that?" he asked, his voice a strained whisper. Richards nodded without speaking, his eyes scanning the trees nervously. They had been walking for hours now, the markers on the map guiding them deeper into the heart of the forest. But nothing prepared them for what they found when they reached the first location. It wasn't a clearing, or an old outpost as Moore had expected. It was something more unsettling. The ground was scorched, as if something had landed there and burned the earth itself. Charred remnants of what could have been debris scattered across the ground, but there was something else, too. Dark, twisted shapes formed in the soil, as if they had been burned into the ground, symbols etched deeply into the earth, symbols that matched those on the map. This wasn't here yesterday," Moore muttered, kneeling down to inspect the strange markings. The heat from the ground still lingered, though the source of the burn was nowhere to be found. The symbols seemed to pulse under his fingers, as though they were alive, as though they were calling to him. Richard stepped closer, his breath shallow. "What the hell happened here?" Before Moore could answer, a rustling sound came from the bushes nearby. They all froze, eyes wide. A shadow moved within the trees, too large to be a simple animal. It was moving fast, unnaturally fast. "Did you see that?" Keller whispered, his voice barely audible. Moore nodded. His heart pounded in his chest as he gripped his weapon, but the instinct to fight felt useless. Whatever they were dealing with wasn't something a rifle would stop. They were in over their heads. The rustling grew louder, closer. Then, out of nowhere, the shadow lunged, faster than they could react. It was a blur of movement, a dark, formless figure that seemed to flicker in and out of sight. And in an instant, it was gone, leaving only the lingering taste of fear in the air. Keller cursed under his breath, his legs shaking. That wasn't a person. That wasn't even human. Moore didn't respond immediately, his eyes scanning the forest around them. He had seen something similar before, back when he was stationed overseas. Soldiers disappearing without a trace, whole squads lost in the middle of operations. They were never found, and the stories never made sense. But what they had just witnessed, it was like a living nightmare, an entity that couldn't be explained by any known force. "We need to keep moving," Moore finally said, his voice low but steady. "The map is still guiding us. We need answers." They pressed on, the weight of their fear pushing them further into the unknown. But with each step, the presence they felt grew stronger. The forest wasn't just quiet now. It was suffocating. The trees seemed to lean closer, as though closing in on them. The shadows grew deeper, more oppressive, and the hum from earlier had returned, thrumming louder now, vibrating in their chests like a pulse. It was everywhere. And then, as they reached the second location marked on the map, things took a turn for the worse. They arrived at an abandoned structure, what had once been a small military outpost, now nothing more than ruins, its walls crumbling and covered in moss. But the moment they stepped inside, Something was wrong. The air was thick, charged with an unnatural energy that made every hair on their bodies stand on end. "Something's not right here," Keller said, his voice shaky. "It feels wrong." Moore couldn't put his finger on it, but he felt it too. It was as if the very ground beneath them had absorbed something terrible, something ancient that had left its mark on this place. There was a faint, pungent odor in the air, like something decaying, but mixed with the metallic scent of ozone. Suddenly, a noise broke the silence, an eerie scraping sound, like something dragging across the floor. They all froze, hearts pounding in their chests. "Who's there?" Richards called out, his voice trembling. But no one answered. Instead, there was a low, guttural sound coming from deep within the building. It was impossible to pinpoint its source, but it felt close. Too close. And then they saw it, a figure standing at the far end of the ruined hallway. It was impossibly tall, its silhouette stretched unnaturally against the decaying walls. The figure seemed to shimmer, flicker in and out of existence like a mirage. The soldiers raised their weapons, but the sight of it paralyzed them. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. Its body was twisted, distorted, like something out of a nightmare. Its face was featureless, smooth, and empty, save for two dark voids where its eyes should have been. The soldiers stood frozen, unable to move. The figure took a step forward, its feet making no sound as it crossed the threshold. And then, without warning, it was gone. Disappeared into thin air. Moore's heart raced as he lowered his weapon, sweat trickling down his brow. He couldn't explain it. No one could. What they had just seen. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a hallucination. It was something else entirely, something from a world beyond their understanding. This isn't just a battle," Moore whispered. "We're not fighting an army. We're fighting something older, something that's been here far longer than we can imagine." Keller and Richards exchanged a look, their faces pale, their fear palpable. They all knew that they were no longer just soldiers in a war. They were entangled in something much darker, something they couldn't hope to survive without answers. The haunting presence had escalated. And now, there was no turning back. By now, the forest had become a labyrinth of madness. The soldiers no longer saw the trees as simply part of the landscape. They had become barriers, looming entities in their own right. Every shadow seemed to stretch longer, every noise amplified into something more menacing. The hum persisted, always in the background, buzzing in their minds, worming its way into their very thoughts. They couldn't shake it, couldn't escape it. They had been deep in the woods for days now, the map in their hands their only guide. But it was becoming clear. Whatever this was, it wasn't just a random anomaly. It wasn't just the work of some foreign enemy, or a freak occurrence from a strange new weapon. This was something far more insidious. The trio sat around a makeshift campfire, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames. They were exhausted, physically and mentally drained, but they couldn't afford to rest. Not with what they had seen, not with the terrifying possibility that their lives were already forfeit. "All right," Moore said, his voice hoarse from lack of sleep. "We need to talk. Really talk." Keller and Richards exchanged uneasy glances. They had been trying to make sense of everything, trying to rationalize the impossible, but they knew deep down that no logical explanation could account for what had been happening. They were dealing with something beyond their comprehension, something that defied every law of nature. Richards finally spoke, his voice laced with doubt. "I don't know about you guys, but I'm starting to think we're in over our heads. This isn't some battlefield problem. This is—" He paused, trying to find the right words. "This is otherworldly. I mean, Look at what we've seen, heard. The lights in the sky, the things we've seen in the forest, that thing that vanished into thin air." Keller nodded in agreement, his eyes dark with fear. "It's like we're trapped in some kind of twisted nightmare. A nightmare that doesn't end. We've tried everything, but nothing makes sense. None of it fits together." The fire crackled as Moore stared into the flames, his mind racing with the same doubts. He had been a soldier for a long time, and he had seen things that most people couldn't even begin to imagine. But this was beyond anything he had ever encountered. "I don't believe in ghosts," Moore finally said, breaking the silence. "And I don't believe in curses either. But whatever this is, it feels like we're being punished. Like we walked into something that was meant to happen, something that had already happened before, maybe even centuries ago." Richards shot him a look of disbelief. "Wait, so you're saying we're part of some ancient ritual? A prophecy?" "That's crazy, Moore. That sounds like something out of a bad science fiction movie." "I know it sounds crazy," Moore replied, his voice steady. "But think about it. The map, the symbols, the objects we found, the metal fragments, the sphere Keller picked up, they all point to the same thing. And those visions we've had, the ones we saw in the ruins, what if they were real? What if we're just the latest chapter in a story that's been unfolding for centuries?" Keller shuddered, his face pale. "So what? You think this is something the military's been hiding from us? That they knew about this thing all along?" Moore didn't answer right away, his mind replaying the odd, unsettling events they'd uncovered. "It's possible. There were hints of this, strange reports, whispers about something in the sky. But no one connected the dots. It was always too unbelievable. Until now." Richards frowned, rubbing his eyes. "Okay, but let's say we're right. Let's say there's some ancient force at play here. What do we do about it? How do we stop it?" The question hung in the air like a noose. There was no answer. They didn't even know what they were facing, let alone how to fight it. The fear that had been slowly creeping into their hearts now bubbled to the surface, a tangible presence that they could no longer ignore. "Maybe we can't stop it," Moore said, his voice low. "Maybe we were never meant to. Maybe this is bigger than any of us. But if we don't try, then we're all just waiting to be swallowed whole. We need to figure out what this is, and we need to do it fast." They sat in silence for a long time, the only sound the crackling of the fire. The theories spun around them like an endless cycle, each more terrifying than the last. Was it an alien force, a supernatural entity, or something even darker, something ancient that had been waiting for the right time to resurface? "Whatever it is," Keller said finally, his voice steadying as he spoke. "We have to face it, no matter what." Moore nodded, the weight of their situation pressing down on him. "We have no choice. We go to the next location on the map, and we find the truth. We can't run from this anymore." But as they packed up their gear and prepared to move on, the oppressive weight of doubt hung heavily in the air. They had made their decision. They would follow the map, follow the clues, even if it meant venturing deeper into the unknown. But deep down, they all knew the truth. There was no going back. Whatever they found next would seal their fate. They had crossed the point of no return, and they couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was waiting for them on that battlefield, in the woods or beyond, had been waiting for a long time. The next day was colder than the others. The sky, a dull gray, seemed to press down on them, suffocating the world around them. The strange, pulsating hum from the forest had grown louder overnight, as if it were feeding off their fear. Every time the soldiers made a move, the noise seemed to follow, wrapping itself around them, burrowing into their minds. Moore, Keller, and Richards had no illusions anymore. They were no longer just soldiers on a battlefield. They were investigators, trapped in a war they hadn't signed up for, one they didn't understand, and one they didn't know how to fight. They had crossed a threshold, and now they had no choice but to keep going. As they followed the map deeper into the woods, the feeling of being watched returned, stronger than ever. Every crack of a branch underfoot, every rustle in the leaves made their nerves jump. They were on edge, every step a calculated risk. But there was no turning back. They were going to the last location marked on the map, the final destination, the place where everything connected. At least, that's what they hoped. The further they ventured, the more surreal the forest seemed. The trees twisted and contorted in unnatural shapes, their gnarled limbs reaching toward them like skeletal arms. The air had a strange taste to it, metallic, as if the forest itself had been poisoned by something ancient and unknowable. It was as though the very earth beneath them was cursed, feeding off the fear that had settled in their bones. "What do you think is waiting for us there?" Keller asked, his voice low, barely a whisper. His eyes darted nervously from side to side, as though he expected something to leap out from behind the trees at any moment. "I don't know," Moore said, his voice grim. "But we'll find out soon enough." Richards was silent, his jaw tight as he scanned the forest. He wasn't sure if he believed in any of the theories Moore had suggested, but what they had experienced so far couldn't be ignored. There was something wrong here, something that went beyond logic, something that had to do with the land, with the strange forces they had encountered. The map had led them to an ancient ruin, a crumbling structure deep within the woods. It had been hidden for so long, forgotten by time, and untouched by war. The building was nothing more than a skeleton now, but it held a kind of eerie majesty in its decay. As the soldiers stepped inside, the air felt heavier, thicker, as though they had crossed a boundary they hadn't meant to cross. The walls of the ruin were lined with carvings, similar to the symbols they had seen before. But these were more intricate, more detailed. There were figures etched into the stone, but they were not human. Their forms were elongated, twisted, almost alien in nature. There was something disturbingly familiar about them, though the soldiers couldn't quite place it. It felt as if they were staring into the eyes of something that had been watching them for a long time. "Look at this," Moore muttered, pointing to a set of markings near the entrance. The symbols seemed to shimmer, almost as if they were alive. He reached out to touch them, but the moment his fingers brushed against the stone, he was hit with a wave of dizziness, his vision blurring. The air seemed to crackle with energy, and for a moment it felt as though the ground beneath them was shifting. Richards grabbed his arm, pulling him back. "Are you okay?" Moore nodded, his head still spinning. "Yeah, I'm fine." But the truth was, he didn't feel fine. The moment he touched the wall, it was like something had connected with him. Something ancient, powerful. It was as though the ruin had recognized him, and in turn, he had recognized it. He stepped away from the wall, his mind racing. He needed to focus. They had come too far to turn back now, but the strange energy in the air was making it difficult to think clearly. The hum from outside seemed to intensify, vibrating through the stone walls, filling the ruin with an eerie resonance. "Let's move," Moore said, his voice tight with urgency. "We need to get to the heart of this place. Whatever's here, it's connected to what's been happening." They ventured deeper into the ruin, the walls narrowing as they descended into a lower chamber. The air grew colder with each step, and the darkness felt more oppressive. Finally, they reached a large circular chamber, the walls lined with more symbols and strange carvings. But what caught their attention was the object in the center of the room. It was a large stone pedestal, worn by time, but still standing strong. Atop the pedestal was a dark, metallic object, something they had seen before, the same iridescent metal they had found in the forest. The object was unlike anything they had ever seen. It was shaped like a sphere, but with strange ridges and grooves running along its surface, as if it had been designed by something other than human hands. "What is this?" Keller whispered, his eyes wide with awe and fear. Moore stepped forward cautiously, his hand hovering just above the sphere. "I don't know, but I think this is it. The source." Before they could react, the room seemed to shift. The walls groaned as though they were alive, the stone vibrating under their feet. A loud, piercing hum filled the air, louder than anything they had heard before. The sphere on the pedestal began to glow, its surface shimmering as if it were coming to life. Richard stepped back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "We need to get out of here." But it was too late. The glow from the sphere intensified, filling the room with a blinding light. For a moment, everything was washed in white, and then, nothing. The soldiers blinked, disoriented, their surroundings gone. The ruin, the pedestal, the sphere, it was all gone. They were no longer standing in the chamber. They were somewhere else, somewhere unfamiliar. The world around them had changed. They were no longer in the forest, no longer in the ruin. The sky above was dark, the air heavy with the scent of burning, and in the distance they could hear the unmistakable sounds of battle. Shouts, explosions, the crackle of gunfire. But these weren't modern guns. They were something older, something more primitive. Moore's heart pounded in his chest as he tried to make sense of what had just happened. "Where are we?" he muttered, his voice barely a whisper. "We've gone back in time," Keller said, his voice trembling. "Somehow, we've gone back." The battle raged around them, but no one could explain why or how they had been transported here. All they knew was that they had crossed a line, and they weren't sure they could ever return to the present. The air around them was thick with smoke, and the earth trembled beneath their feet as the sounds of distant battle grew louder. Moore's heart raced, the realization creeping over him that the soldiers were no longer standing on the battlefield they knew. The sky was heavy with dark clouds, the remnants of an ancient storm that seemed to linger far too long. The terrain was different, too, craggy, uneven, with charred remains of what might have once been a village scattered across the land. "What the hell is going on?" Richards asked, his voice strained as he gripped his rifle, eyes darting nervously around them. Moore didn't have an answer. He had seen a lot of strange things in his life, but this was beyond anything he could have prepared for. They had been in that ruin one moment, and now they were in a completely different place, a different time. The sound of combat echoed in the distance, but the battle they were hearing wasn't from their world. It wasn't from any war they knew. It was something older. "This isn't possible," Keller muttered, taking a hesitant step forward, his eyes scanning the landscape. "We've crossed over into some other reality, some parallel time." Moore's gaze was drawn toward the horizon, where the sounds of the battle were coming from. Figures were silhouetted against the haze, wearing clothing that looked like it belonged to a different era. Soldiers with primitive weapons, their faces marked with the grime of war, were fighting with each other, firing guns that looked centuries old. "They're fighting," Keller whispered, his eyes wide with disbelief. Moore's gut twisted. There was something deeply wrong about this place. He didn't know how or why, but it felt like they had stepped into the middle of a war that had already been lost, a war that had no end. There were echoes here. The past, present, and future were colliding, and in the center of it all was that damned sphere. "We need to find out what's happening," Moore said firmly, his mind racing. "We need to find a way back to our time. This can't be real. It can't." But as they began to move cautiously toward the battle, something shifted. The air grew colder, the ground beneath them vibrating once again, but this time it was different. It was a deep, resonant tremor, like the world itself was shaking with a power they couldn't see or understand. A low, guttural sound rose from the earth, reverberating through their bodies. It wasn't the sound of distant fighting. It was something far more ancient, a sound that seemed to belong to the earth itself. The hairs on the back of Moore's neck stood on end as he turned toward the sound. And there, emerging from the shadows of the crumbling battlefield, was a figure, a massive, dark shape. It moved with an unnatural grace, its body flickering in and out of existence, like a distortion in space. Moore's breath caught in his throat. It was the same thing they had seen before in the forest, the shadowy, formless entity. But now it was more real than ever, more terrifying than he could have ever imagined. "It is here," Keller whispered, barely audible, his voice thick with fear. Richards, his rifle shaking in his hands, raised it, but Moore grabbed his arm before he could fire. "Don't," he warned. "It's not going to stop because we shoot at it. This is something different." The figure approached them slowly, its form warping in the air. It had no distinct features, just a looming mass of shadow, flickering with intermittent flashes of light. The hum that had been following them, the hum that had been gnawing at their sanity, grew louder, vibrating through the very ground they stood on. The soldiers could feel it now. Whatever this was, it was feeding off their fear. It was growing stronger, more solid with every passing second. The figure seemed to shift, coiling around them like a living nightmare, its presence suffocating. "You should never have come here," a voice boomed, though there was no mouth to speak it. The voice was everywhere, surrounding them, filling their minds. It wasn't human. It wasn't even alive in the way they understood it. Keller stepped back, his eyes wide with panic. "What is that? What is it saying?" Moore's chest tightened. He knew the voice. It was the same thing they had heard in the visions, the same voice that had haunted them from the moment they'd stepped into the forest. It was the presence behind everything, the one that had been pulling the strings, manipulating time, weaving this horrible web that now surrounded them. It's trying to communicate," Moore said, his voice barely audible, his mind reeling. "It's not just an entity. It's something older, something beyond time." The figure seemed to lean closer, its presence overwhelming. Moore could feel it pressing down on him, suffocating him. It was as though the figure was a living embodiment of the very earth they stood on. An ancient force that had witnessed all of history, had shaped it in ways the soldiers couldn't comprehend. And then, the ground beneath them cracked open, sending a shockwave through the air. The battle in the distance ceased, as if the world itself held its breath. The shadows around them shifted, the earth groaning with a terrible, unnatural force. The soldiers stumbled back, struggling to keep their footing as the entity before them writhed in the air, its form growing more defined, more powerful. "You don't belong here," the voice echoed again. And this time, it wasn't just in their heads. They could feel the words, taste them in the air, pressing against their minds like an invisible hand. "This is my domain, and you are nothing." The figure surged forward, its form flickering violently as it enveloped them in an unnatural darkness. The soldiers tried to fight, tried to resist, but it was too late. Their rifles were useless, their legs were weak, their minds, overwhelmed by the pressure of the entity's presence, began to fracture. Moore's vision blurred, his heart hammered in his chest as his body fought against the crushing force. And then, something shifted within him. The moment of clarity that had eluded him for so long, the realization of what was happening. "This is it," Moore whispered, his voice ragged. "This is the battle." The entity was not just a force of nature. It was a warrior, a creature bound to the land, to the conflict that had raged here for centuries. It had fought battles long before the soldiers ever stepped foot on this land, and it would continue to fight long after they were gone. And in that moment, Moore understood the horrifying truth. They were part of the war, but they would never win. The darkness pressed in around them, thick and suffocating, like they were trapped in some kind of living nightmare. Moore could feel his breath coming in ragged gasps, his heart pounding in his chest as the figure, the entity, loomed before them, its form shifting and warping like a shadow made of smoke. Every time he blinked, it seemed to grow larger, more menacing. The air was freezing, and every step they took felt heavier, as though the ground itself was pulling them into the abyss. The hum was deafening now, vibrating through every inch of their bodies, threatening to rip them apart. The force of it was so strong, so overwhelming, that Moore could hardly think. His mind was clouded with dread, his thoughts a jumbled mess as the figure advanced on them, its presence suffocating everything in its path. Richard staggered back, his face pale, his rifle still gripped tightly in his hands but useless against what they were facing. "This can't be happening. We can't just stay here. We need to get out now." But Moore knew it wasn't that simple. He could feel it, the truth that had been growing inside him ever since they had stepped foot on that cursed battlefield. They weren't just trapped physically. They were trapped in time, in a loop, in a place that didn't play by the rules of their world. There was no escape from this. They were caught in something ancient, something far more powerful than they could ever hope to understand. He turned to Keller, whose eyes were wide with panic, his breath coming out in short, sharp bursts. "We can't outrun this," Moore said, his voice strained. "We can't fight it. We're stuck here." "Stuck?" Keller's voice cracked, his gaze flickering to Richard's for support. "What do you mean, stuck? We're gonna die here. We need to do something, anything." The desperation in Keller's voice was palpable, and Moore felt it too. The crushing sense of helplessness, the realization that they were running out of time, and fast. His eyes darted around the battlefield, his mind scrambling for a way out, but there was nothing. No safe place, no escape route, just the entity in front of them, the distorted, flickering shadows closing in like the jaws of a beast. Then, as if on cue, the ground beneath their feet shifted again. This time, it was more violent, a violent tremor that sent them sprawling to the dirt. Moore caught himself just in time, his fingers digging into the ground as the shaking intensified. It was as if the world itself was being torn apart. The humming sound grew louder, deeper, more terrifying, until it was all they could hear. It filled their heads, buzzing through their thoughts, dousing any hope they might have had left. And then, suddenly, it stopped. The silence was worse than the noise. It was suffocating, oppressive. The world stood still, frozen, as if even time had paused to witness whatever was coming next. Moore's breath caught in his throat. He knew something was about to happen. He could feel it, deep in his bones. And when the figure, the entity, finally moved, it wasn't just a flicker in the darkness anymore. It manifested fully, its shape clear and distinct, no longer a mere shadow or distortion. It was a hulking, grotesque thing, towering over them, a nightmarish creature of impossible proportions. Its body was a mass of swirling black smoke, but it had structure, twisted limbs that bent at unnatural angles, clawed hands that reached toward them like death itself. Its face, or what could be called a face, was a swirling void, a black hole that seemed to swallow all light and color, leaving only emptiness behind, and it was staring directly at Moore. "I am the reckoning," the voice boomed, reverberating through their minds. "I am the war that never ends. You are nothing." Moore's body froze, his mind reeling. The figure wasn't just an enemy. It was everything that had gone wrong with the world. It was the embodiment of the endless cycle of violence and death, an ancient force that had witnessed countless wars, countless battles, and had been here long before any of them. It was the cause and the effect, the predator and the prey. But he wasn't ready to give in. Not yet. "You're wrong," Moore spat, his voice hoarse but defiant. "You're not the end. We are." The entity tilted its head slightly, the air around it thickening with malevolent energy. "You are? You have no place here, mortal. You cannot fight the endless tide of war." Moore stood tall, despite the terror clawing at his insides. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, but he knew this was the only chance they had left. This was it. If they didn't fight back now, they would never get out of here. "Maybe we can't fight you directly," Moore said, his voice growing stronger. "But we don't need to. We just need to stop you. Stop this cycle. Stop this war." The entity let out a sound like a low growl, its form shifting violently, as though it was preparing to strike. "You will never stop me. I am the catalyst. I am the beginning of all things. You are nothing but a passing flicker in the long history of death." Moore's mind raced. He remembered the map, the markings, the sphere they had found, the strange relics that had drawn them here in the first place, the symbols, the visions, the connections they had all made as they pieced together the puzzle of this land, of this curse. It was clear now. "It's not just a battlefield," Moore said, his voice steady as he gazed at the figure. "It's a cycle, a loop that feeds on war, on conflict. It repeats over and over, but this time it ends. We end it." The figure recoiled, a ripple of anger passing through its form, and in that instant, Moore realized what needed to be done. This wasn't just about surviving. It was about breaking the curse, about stopping the cycle of violence that had infected this land for centuries. "We break the cycle," Moore whispered to himself, barely able to believe it. "We break it by breaking the land." Without warning, he turned and sprinted toward the pedestal, the source of everything. He could feel the entity's gaze on him, the weight of its presence suffocating him. But he couldn't stop now. He had to act. Behind him, Richards and Keller followed, desperate, driven by the same realization. They had no idea if this would work. No idea what would happen when they reached the pedestal. But they knew one thing. They had to try. The distance between them and the pedestal felt like a lifetime, but Moore pushed forward, his legs burning with each step. The air around him felt heavier with every inch he gained. The entity, still looming, seemed to grow larger, more unstable as it hissed with fury. The ground beneath Moore's feet cracked, and the sky above darkened further, the wind picking up with an unnatural force, as if the entire world was protesting his every move. But Moore didn't stop. He couldn't. Behind him, Keller and Richards were struggling to keep up, their breath ragged, their faces pale with fear. But they were determined, too. If Moore could break the cycle, if he could destroy whatever was binding them to this place, then maybe, just maybe, they could escape this nightmare. As they reached the pedestal, Moore's gaze fixed on the object sitting atop it, the iridescent sphere. It pulsed with an otherworldly light, a faint hum radiating from it that seemed to match the rhythm of his heartbeat. The closer he got, the more intense the sensation grew. It was as if the sphere was pulling him in, as if it knew what he was thinking, what he intended to do. More, Keller gasped from behind him, his voice low and strained. What if we're making a mistake? What if this, whatever it is, feeds on us? What if touching it does something worse? Moore didn't turn around. His mind was set. The entity had been feeding on this cycle of conflict for centuries. It had used the land as its weapon, its battleground. But the sphere, it was the key. The sphere was the source of the cycle. If they could destroy it, they could destroy the curse. He reached out, his fingers trembling as he hovered just above the surface of the sphere. The moment his hand made contact, the air around them cracked with energy, as if the very fabric of reality was snapping. His body surged with electricity, cold, sharp, and painful, sending waves of disorienting sensations through him. The hum intensified, filling every part of his mind, threatening to drown him. And then, in that brief moment, something clicked. The sphere vibrated violently, the energy within it coiling tighter, its light pulsing erratically. Moore's fingers tightened around it, and with a force of will he didn't know he had, he began to twist it in his hand. The ground trembled again, louder this time, a deafening roar reverberating through the air. The entity's voice, no longer a whisper but a booming scream, filled the air, furious and panicked. You cannot undo what has been done!" But Moore didn't stop. He turned the sphere with every ounce of strength he had. He could feel it now, the connection between the sphere and the very ground beneath him, the weight of everything, the lives lost, the cycles of violence. It was all bound to this object, to the land itself. And as he turned the sphere, the land began to fight back. He twisted harder. The sky split open, a flash of light so bright that Moore had to shield his eyes. The entity shrieked, its form flickering wildly, writhing in agony. The very earth seemed to scream, the ground beneath their feet cracking open as if trying to swallow them whole. Moore's chest tightened, the force of the energy flowing through him almost too much to bear. "Hold on!" Moore shouted to his comrades, though he wasn't sure if they could hear him. The air around him was thick, almost suffocating, as though time itself was distorting, pulling them into a space that shouldn't exist. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Moore staggered back, his legs unsteady, as the sphere in his hand slowly came to a stop. The energy around him dissipated, leaving an eerie calm in its wake. For a moment, it felt like the world had frozen in time. The land, the hum, the war, everything was still. The entity, whatever it was gone. The air around them was clear now, the oppressive weight lifting as though it had never been there. The shadows that had loomed over them seemed to retreat, and the battle noises from the distance faded into nothing. For the first time since they had arrived, the world felt quiet. But the quiet was unsettling. Moore turned to Keller and Richards, his mind still reeling from what had just happened. The silence pressed in on them, heavy and unnatural. The three men stood there, staring at one another, the reality of their situation sinking in. "Did it work?" Richards asked, his voice uncertain, his eyes scanning the stillness around them. "I think it did," Moore said, though even as he spoke, doubt crept into his mind. Had they really broken the cycle? Was it truly over, or had they merely awakened something worse? The land, the entity, it had all been tied to that sphere. If they had destroyed it, had they destroyed the curse along with it? Or had they simply freed it, allowing it to spread somewhere else, somewhere worse? The thought lingered like a dark shadow. But as Moore looked around them, something caught his eye, a glimmer in the distance, faint but unmistakable. The horizon, once so dark and heavy with the weight of the battle, was now bathed in a strange golden light, as if the land itself was waking up. The air was clearer. The suffocating presence was gone. "Look," Keller said, pointing. "Oh, it's changing." Moore turned his gaze to the sky, his eyes narrowing. The golden light grew brighter, spreading across the land. The forest, the battlefield, it was transforming. The charred, ruined earth seemed to heal, the scorched trees slowly growing green again, the soil returning to life. The land, the war, it was ending. Whatever force had been feeding off the violence was no longer there to keep it alive. But the question still remained. Had they truly ended it? Or was this just the beginning of something new? Moore didn't know. He couldn't know. All he could do was wait for the world to reveal its answer. The transformation before their eyes was both awe-inspiring and unsettling. The land seemed to breathe again, as if the very earth had shaken off centuries of decay and violence. The golden light spread like wildfire, bathing everything in its warmth. The forest, once dark and oppressive, now glowed with a life that hadn't been seen in decades. Flowers bloomed in the dirt, the trees seemed to straighten and reach upward, and the sky, once an endless storm of clouds, was now clear. The dark masses, breaking apart into something resembling hope. But Moore didn't feel relief. He didn't feel the peace that he expected. Instead, there was a nagging feeling in his gut, a whisper that refused to leave him. This wasn't over. It couldn't be. "What just happened?" Keller whispered, staring at the horizon where the golden light spread farther with each passing second. Richards looked just as bewildered. "Did we do it? Did we really stop it?" Moore clenched his fists. "I don't know. I don't think we ended it. I think we've just set it in motion again." The words felt like a punch to the chest. The weight of them hung in the air between them, heavier than anything Moore had ever felt. He had broken the cycle, yes. But what if the cycle was something inevitable, something ancient? What if they hadn't ended the war at all, but simply allowed it to begin again? He glanced around, searching for some sign that they had truly escaped. But the land, despite its healing, felt wrong. The golden light was beautiful, sure, but it had an unnatural glow to it, an almost too perfect radiance that made Moore's skin crawl. A distant rumble interrupted his thoughts, faint at first but growing louder, closer. He looked back at Keller and Richards, who both turned toward the sound as well. It was coming from the edge of the forest, the same direction they had come from, the place where the battle had been. The sky, now brighter, seemed to ripple as something massive moved through the trees. "What's happening?" Keller asked, panic creeping into his voice. Before Moore could respond, there was a flash, a blinding white light that illuminated the entire forest. The ground trembled again, not with the same chaotic force as before, but with an unsettling certainty. It was as if the earth was alive, as though the entire landscape was waking up after a long slumber, only to find itself threatened. The golden light flickered and began to pulse, and Moore realized with growing horror that the land was not just healing. It was preparing for something. Something terrible. The forest groaned again, a deep, guttural sound that vibrated through the trees, and the once clear sky clouded over once more. Keller grabbed Moore's arm. "What is that? What's happening?" Moore didn't know how to answer. The realization hit him like a wave, crashing against his chest. The cycle wasn't broken. It was restarting. The land, the battle, the violence, it had been sealed in this place for centuries, bound to repeat itself over and over. No matter what they did, no matter how they tried to stop it, it was always coming back. "It's not over," Moore said, his voice low, the weight of his words sinking into the group. This place, it's cursed. It was always cursed. Richards shook his head, his eyes wide with disbelief. No, we stopped it. We saw the land healing. We saw the light. We ended the war. But Moore didn't believe it. Not for a second. He had felt it the moment the sphere had been destroyed. That energy, that pull, it had been too strong. It wasn't a simple artifact. It was the core of the cycle, the thing that had been keeping the land in its eternal loop. Breaking it didn't stop the cycle. It only changed it, woke it up from its slumber. They had released the power that had been contained for centuries, and now it was free to follow its course again. The rumbling grew louder, now accompanied by a series of flashes of light that blazed across the horizon. Moore's heart raced as he looked back at the forest. Figures, shapes, forms began to emerge from the trees. They were soldiers, but not the same soldiers they had seen before. These were not from any modern army. These were figures from another time. Soldiers in ancient armor, their faces obscured by masks, their weapons raised high, as if ready for battle. But these were not just the enemy. They were part of the same cycle, the same war that had been happening for centuries. This is impossible, Keller whispered, backing away. Moore didn't know what was more terrifying, the fact that the soldiers were appearing again, or the fact that they seemed completely oblivious to the golden light that had flooded the land. The battle was beginning again, like a twisted repetition of history. Only now, they were the ones caught in the middle of it. The soldiers were not fighting one another anymore. They were fighting the land itself, as if the earth, the very ground they stood on, was now their enemy. This isn't a war, Moore muttered. It's a ritual, a punishment, a cycle that's been playing out over and over again, and we're just part of it now. The soldiers began to move, marching toward them, their weapons gleaming in the fading light. Moore's pulse quickened. The figures were not human, not in the way they had understood it. They were shadows, echoes of the past, the physical embodiment of the violence and chaos that had been taking place on this land for generations. It wasn't just a single battle anymore. It was everything. The past, present, and future were all entangled, fighting each other, battling for control over this cursed land. Moore's mind raced. They had released something. They had opened a door that had been sealed for centuries. They had disrupted the balance, and now the land was fighting back, dragging them all back into the cycle of war. But even as he thought it, Moore knew there was no escaping it. The land was pulling them back into the past, forcing them to repeat the same bloody history over and over again. Every attempt to stop it would only serve to restart it. The cycle would never end, and they were trapped. Moore's breath caught in his chest as the soldiers from another time marched toward them. They moved with the same mechanical precision, as though driven by something other than human will. Their weapons, gleaming and rusted with the passage of time, glinted menacingly in the golden light. The battle was no longer just a physical struggle. It had become something much deeper, something almost ritualistic. This was no longer about winning or losing. It was about survival within the relentless loop that had defined this land for centuries. "What are we supposed to do now?" Richards asked, his voice tight with panic, his eyes darting between the advancing soldiers and Moore. Moore swallowed hard. He didn't have an answer. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing in on him, the weight of history, of the earth itself, pulling them into its grasp. The land was no longer a passive observer. It was a participant, alive with the energy of the cycle, and they were caught in its center, powerless to escape. "We fight," Moore said, though his words felt hollow. His chest tightened as he watched the soldiers approach. "We have to fight, not just for survival, but to break this cycle, for good. If we don't, we're going to become part of the war. Forever. Keller's face twisted with doubt. You think we can stop this with just guns and firepower? No, Moore said sharply. We need to stop it by understanding what it really is. These soldiers, they're not alive in the way we understand it. This isn't just a war. They're manifestations of the curse, part of the ritual that keeps this land in a constant state of conflict. We need to break it at the source. Moore's mind raced as he scanned the battlefield, trying to find a way to break the loop, to stop the soldiers, to stop the land from pulling them back into the chaos. The golden light continued to pulse in waves, casting everything in an otherworldly glow. It was as though the land itself was waiting for something, a final piece to the puzzle, a key that would either free them or bind them to this nightmare forever. That pedestal, Moore said suddenly, his eyes locking onto the place where the sphere had once rested. If we destroy it, maybe that'll disrupt the cycle once and for all. The sphere was the key, but it's not enough to just break it. The pedestal itself, it's a part of the ritual. If we destroy it, maybe we can sever the link between the land and the war. Richards and Keller exchanged uncertain glances, but Moore's resolve was clear. He knew what had to be done. They had already gone too far to turn back now. The land was drawing them in, but if they were going to have any chance of breaking free, they had to destroy the core of the ritual, the pedestal, the source of the curse. The soldiers were closer now, the ground shaking beneath their feet with every step they took. The soldiers' faces remained hidden behind masks, their movements swift and precise. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. They were here to fight, to fulfill their purpose in the never-ending cycle of war. Let's move, Moore said, his voice low but firm. We have no time to waste. They sprinted towards the pedestal, the noise of the approaching soldiers growing louder, more oppressive. But as Moore reached the pedestal, something stopped him. The ground beneath them shifted once again, more violently this time, as if the earth itself was rejecting their presence. In that moment, everything around them seemed to pause. The soldiers, the land, the sky, all of it stood still. The golden light dimmed, and the air became thick with tension. Do you feel that? Keller asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Moore nodded, his stomach dropping. This wasn't just the cycle repeating. It was the culmination of it. The ritual had reached its peak, and it was now or never. If they didn't destroy the pedestal now, they would be consumed by the war, trapped forever in the never-ending loop. But the pedestal wasn't just an object. It was a part of the land itself, an ancient anchor that had been tied to the earth for centuries. Destroying it wouldn't just break the ritual, it would alter the very fabric of this place. Moore stepped forward, his heart pounding, and gripped the pedestal with both hands. The earth beneath him seemed to roar as the golden light intensified, burning bright enough to sear his skin. His hands tingled with the raw energy pulsing from the pedestal. It was alive. It was aware of what he was about to do. "Do it, Moore!" Richards shouted, his voice strained. "Now!" With all his strength, Moore wrenched at the pedestal, his muscles screaming as he pulled with everything he had. The ground buckled beneath his feet as the pedestal resisted, but Moore's resolve never faltered. This had to be done. The ritual, the war, the land, they all needed to end. Then, with a force that felt like it was shaking the entire world, the pedestal cracked, a deep groan echoing through the land. The golden light flared brighter than ever before, blinding them all, and in that moment, Moore felt a surge of power, pure, unadulterated energy that threatened to tear him apart. The pedestal shattered, its pieces scattering like dust in the wind. The shockwave was immediate, the sky erupted in a flash of light, and the ground shook violently as if the very earth was screaming in agony. The soldiers, those timeless warriors, faltered in their march, their forms flickering and distorting. The land groaned, a deep, guttural sound as the curse was undone. Moore dropped to his knees, gasping for breath, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on him. The soldiers began to dissolve, their forms fading into nothingness as the energy from the shattered pedestal coursed through the land. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. The golden light dimmed, and the rumbling of the earth faded away. The air around them was still, the oppressive weight finally gone. The forest was quiet again, but as Moore stood, trembling, he felt the change. It wasn't just the battle that was over, it was the war. The endless cycle of violence and death had finally been broken. Keller and Richard stood beside him, their faces pale but filled with a sense of disbelief. "We did it," Keller said, his voice almost a whisper. But Moore didn't speak. He simply stared at the land, at the sky, at the now quiet forest. The war was over, yes, but in the back of his mind, Moore wondered, was this truly the end? Or was it just another cycle beginning to take shape? He would never know for sure. The only thing Moore could be certain of was that, for the first time in a long time, the land was finally at peace. Just when they thought it was over, a strange sensation crept through Moore's chest, a whisper in the air that made his skin crawl. It wasn't the golden light that had bathed the land, nor the eerie silence that followed the destruction of the pedestal. It was something far more sinister, something that still lingered in the background, just out of sight. Moore stood there for a long moment, staring at the now still forest. The land had healed, the curse had been broken, or so he thought. The soldiers were gone, their spectral forms fading into nothingness as the ritual came to an end. The cycle was supposed to be over, the land no longer bound by the war, the endless conflict. But something wasn't right. The hair on the back of Moore's neck stood on end as he glanced around, feeling a growing sense of unease. The golden light, which had seemed so bright and promising, was now dulling to a soft, pale hue, like a dying ember. The air felt thicker, heavier, as if something was moving just beneath the surface, something they hadn't anticipated. "Moore." Keller's voice was strained, and when Moore turned to face him, he saw that Keller's face was pale, his eyes wide with shock. "What's wrong?" Moore asked, his voice low and filled with concern. Keller didn't answer immediately. He was staring at the horizon, his expression one of disbelief. It's happening again." Moore's heart sank. He followed Keller's gaze, but at first he saw nothing. The forest was still, silent. The light had faded, yes, but there was nothing to suggest that the war was about to start again. Yet the sense of dread that had been building inside him wouldn't let go. There was something off about the way the land had shifted. Something had changed beneath the surface. Then, suddenly, a flicker in the distance, a shadow that moved unnaturally fast. Moore's eyes widened as he saw it again, a dark shape crossing the horizon just at the edge of his vision. He wasn't imagining it. It was real. "Did you see that?" Richards asked, his voice a mix of disbelief and terror. Before Moore could respond, the ground beneath them trembled again, but this time, it wasn't just the subtle shift they'd felt earlier. It was a violent jolt, a quake that rattled the trees and sent them stumbling. The air seemed to vibrate with an eerie hum, a low frequency that resonated through their bones. It felt like the land was alive again, as if it was waking up from a long slumber. But this time, it wasn't the same hum. This was darker, more primal. "What the hell is going on?" Keller shouted over the noise. "We broke the cycle! We destroyed the pedestal! Why is this still happening?" Moore didn't have an answer. His mind raced, but there was nothing logical about what they were experiencing. The pedestal had been destroyed. The ritual should have ended, but the land was still shaking, still alive with an energy they couldn't control. Something was wrong. And then, as if on cue, the first figure appeared. It was a soldier. But not a soldier like the ones they had seen before. This one was different. Its form was distorted, a twisted, unnatural version of a soldier, its face hidden by a grotesque mask that seemed to shift and melt before their eyes. Its body was made of shifting shadows, and its movements were jerky, unnatural. It looked like it was struggling to exist, as if it were constantly fighting against its own form. Moore's heart raced as more figures began to emerge, one after another, each more distorted than the last. They weren't soldiers anymore. They weren't even human. They were fragments, twisted remnants of the original war, manifestations of something darker, something that shouldn't exist. The cycle hadn't just been broken, it had fractured, and now the land was giving birth to something new, something far worse. "They're not real," Richards muttered, backing away in fear. "This isn't happening. This can't be happening." But it was. The figures, more and more of them, emerged from the shadows, and Moore realized with growing dread that they weren't just the echoes of the past. They were the future manifestations of an endless, eternal war that would continue to grow and evolve, no matter how hard they tried to stop it. This land, this cursed place, wasn't just tied to a single moment in history. It was bound to every moment, every battle, every war that had ever taken place, and every one that would take place in the future. And now, they were part of it. "They're splintering," Moore said, his voice hoarse. "The cycle, it's breaking apart into fragments. The war didn't end. It can't end. It's a part of the land now, a part of the world." The soldiers, if they could still be called that, began to move toward them. But their faces were wrong. They were no longer human. They were twisted, their eyes hollow, their expressions blank, like marionettes with no strings. They weren't trying to kill them. They were trying to force them to join the cycle. Moore could feel the pull. It was subtle at first, just a tug at the back of his mind, but it grew stronger. The land wanted them. The ritual wanted them. They were the final pieces needed to complete the cycle, to make the war eternal. "No," Moore whispered to himself. "I won't let it happen. I won't become part of this." He grabbed Keller and Richards, pulling them back as the figures grew closer. The air felt thicker now, almost suffocating, and the ground trembled more violently beneath their feet. The soldiers reached them, their grotesque forms flickering and shifting. And then, one of them, the one at the front, the largest, its body like a swirling mass of shadow, reached out with a hand that was too long, too thin, and touched Moore's chest. The world stopped. In an instant, everything was gone. The forest, the figures, the land. It all vanished into a void of nothingness. There was no sound, no light, just silence, cold, empty. For a moment, Moore thought he was dead. He thought they all were. But then, slowly, he felt it. The pull again. This time stronger. It was calling them, pulling them back. And in that moment, Moore understood. They hadn't broken the cycle. They had only disrupted it. And now, the war had found them. They were part of the land, part of the ritual, and there would never be any escape. The silence lingered, suffocating in its vastness. Moore's heart hammered in his chest, his pulse thrumming like a warning bell. He stood motionless in the void, trying to comprehend what had just happened. The forest, the soldiers, everything had vanished in an instant, replaced by an oppressive, cold emptiness that swallowed everything. But then he felt it, a pull deep within his chest. It was as if something was dragging him back, like invisible hands reaching into his very soul, tearing at the fabric of his reality. Moore's breath caught in his throat. It wasn't the first time he had felt it. It was the same pull, the same sensation of being connected to something ancient, something alive, something that refused to let go. He tried to resist, to fight against the force, but it was futile. Every fiber of his being screamed to break free, but the land wouldn't let him. The pull grew stronger, the edges of his vision blurring. And in that moment, Moore realized the terrifying truth. There would be no escape. Not for him, not for Keller, not for Richards. They were part of the war now, entangled in its endless cycle, bound by the very land they had tried to break free from. Suddenly, a voice echoed through the void. It wasn't a voice in the traditional sense, but a sound that filled his mind, vibrating through his skull. You cannot escape what has been set in motion. Moore's blood ran cold. He recognized the voice. It was the same voice that had haunted him, the same voice from the entity that had tormented them in the forest. But this time it wasn't just a whisper. It was everywhere, inside him, around him, inescapable. It has always been, the voice continued, its tone a mix of anger and resignation. The war, the cycle, you have disturbed it, but now you are a part of it. You are bound to it, like everything before you, and everything after. The words stung. They were a final blow, a confirmation of their worst fear. The land, the soldiers, the curse. It wasn't just a single moment. It was a loop, an eternal repetition of violence, of death, of war, and Moore and his comrades were trapped within it, forever. As the pull intensified, Moore's vision snapped back to reality. The golden light had returned, flickering now, distorted. The forest was no longer calm. The ground shook once again, as if the very earth was convulsing with the anger of being disturbed. The soldiers, those soldiers, emerged from the shadows, their twisted forms looming over him. "You belong to us now," they whispered, their voices an amalgamation of hundreds of lost souls, their faces warping with each passing second. Moore fell to his knees, his body weak from the overwhelming presence. He couldn't move. He couldn't fight. It was too much. But then, as if by sheer will, Moore forced himself to rise. He wasn't going to give in. Not yet. Not without one last fight. There had to be something they could do, some way to break this. But as he stood, the land seemed to shift once again. The ground cracked open beneath him, and the soldiers' figures blurred, their faces becoming more grotesque and distorted. It was as though reality itself was starting to break apart, pulling them all back into the cycle they had tried to escape. The hum, the thrum, the tremors. It was all coming back, stronger than ever. Maybe this was never about understanding, Moore thought to himself, the words echoing through his mind. Maybe it was always meant to be like this, a never-ending loop of chaos that no one can escape. And then, as the soldiers surrounded him, as the land swallowed them whole, Moore realized that there was no end to this war. It would continue, forever, because the land itself demanded it. The cycle could never truly be broken. The figures advanced, and Moore, resigned, closed his eyes, prepared to be pulled into the endless spiral. But even in that final moment, a thought lingered in his mind. Could this really happen? Thank you for watching. Could this truly be the end of the story? Or is it just the beginning of another cycle? Leave your thoughts below. What do you think happened to Moore and his comrades? What is the true power behind the cycle of war? Thank you for following along. Until next time.